Live. I'm your host, Shelley Tingle from the U.S. Army Engineer Research and Development Center's Corporate Communications Office. Joining me today is Dr. Ty Wamsley from the Coastal and Hydraulics Laboratory, located right here in Vicksburg, Mississippi. October becomes the end of our hurricane season, and it has been a busy one this year. We will talk today to Dr. Wamsley about ERDC's research in helping solve the challenges these powerful storms pose. Today's discussion will focus on the vital research projects underway at CHL, especially those focused on innovative methods to forecast storm events, model a storm's impact, mitigate the storm's effects, and develop a more resilient coastal network. Welcome, Dr. Wamsley. We're going to dive right in.
All right, thanks, Shelley.
Hurricane Ida made landfall along the Louisiana Gulf Coast in late August, bringing with it high winds, heavy rains, and a deadly storm surge that engulfed several low-lying areas. That surge, rain, and wind also tested the new levee system that protects New Orleans, a system that was redesigned and rebuilt after Hurricane Katrina in 2005. Much of the research on modeling and design of that upgraded system was conducted at ERDC's facility in Vicksburg in the months and years after Katrina. What was different with the new system, and how did it perform during Hurricane Ida?
Hurricane Ida was a test. It was really one of the first big tests, I guess you could say, for the completed system, and it performed just really as designed. And it was the design of that system, and now the operation of that system, was the work of a large collaborative group of people. And so the Corps of Engineers, the state of Louisiana, all of our partners that participated in that really have a lot to be proud of that it did perform so well. So we're very, very, very happy about that. It was very different from the system that was in place when Hurricane Katrina hit. Of course, that system, if we want to call it a system, did not perform so well. And in the wake of that, what the Corps did was it established the Interagency Performance Evaluation Task Force, and that group was brought together to really do a forensic analysis and a risk-based assessment of what went wrong, so that we could learn from that and not make the same mistakes in the future. And so the first thing I really want to highlight, and this kind of be a theme I think that kind of goes throughout, is it was an interagency task force. And so interagency collaboration. And you're going to see that really everything that we're doing in this area as the Corps of Engineers, it's a collaborative effort with partners really across all of our federal agencies, internationally, academic partners, industry partners, state agencies, environmental groups, everybody really coming together to really understand what happened, what we need to do to make our coast more safe and more resilient. So IPET dove in, did the analysis, and there was really, I think, three kind of overarching lessons that was learned from that. And first is that the system did not perform as a system. That was number one. So what we had is it was really more of a kind of a collection of projects rather than an integrated system. And one, it wasn't complete. So that was a problem. And then two, the design of the various projects that made up that system really took different approaches, different assumptions and things like that, and really didn't consider the interaction between the various projects in an appropriate way. So that was one thing. The second thing is that the design and the planning and design was not risk-based. And that's really important, to take a risk-based approach so that you have a consistent understanding of the hazard in a probabilistic sense across the entire system. And so what that allows you to do, that allows you to really understand the relative vulnerability of the various areas in the system, and then tie that to consequences in an appropriate way so that you really understand what your risk is. And then the third thing is it wasn't resilient. And so and what we're talking about here is resilience in the sense that if a storm does exceed the level for what it was designed for, what you don't want to have happen is a catastrophic failure. So if waves start to overtop, you don't want that to erode, then cause a breach and a catastrophic failure. And we didn't have that in this system. And the other important component that was brought up in IPET is there is a time dependence to this resilience. So you also want to have a system that's designed so that it can adapt as time moves on to account for changes in the landscape or changes in the hazard due to climate change or something like that, so that you can continue to have an appropriate level of risk reduction. So we took all those lessons learned and incorporated that into the new design. And so what was really done different? One, it was designed as an integrated system. So levees, flood walls, pumping stations, the natural landscape, all of those things were considered really in concert, and kind of consistent approaches in dealing with those, and the interaction of those were all considered in the planning and in the design. The second thing was, and this is really where ERDC was heavily involved, again, with a lot of partners and collaboration across the entire coastal world, really, was characterization of the hazard. So the really big thing was the development of a new coupled numerical modeling system that simulated all of the relevant processes. Absolutely key. And so what we were able to do, we developed a system that was able to, one, properly resolve the entire system. So unstructured grid technology. So you could get the definition and the detail and represent the system appropriately, all the way down to like meter level where we needed it. But out in the open ocean, you didn't need that much. You could have kilometer scale grid spacing and things like that. But you had to have the Atlantic Ocean and the Gulf of Mexico all in this same grid, because there's basin to basin physics that are going on that are important to capture to really get the right predictions. And so we were developing this system that allows us to efficiently do that, or as efficiently as possible. But large grids required big supercomputers in order to run these things. But it was really, and then the other thing that was really important was the coupling of waves and storm surge and water levels together, really for the first time in a tightly coupled manner. And that required appropriately resolving where wave breaking occurs, and then having those models talk back and forth to each other and that feedback, so you can get very accurate predictions of what the waves and water levels will be. And the other big piece of that was also appropriately representing the landscape, the land cover and things like that on the thing, because that has an impact on how storm surge propagates. So that new system, this new modeling system, was really key. The second big advancement that was absolutely important was a new probabilistic analysis approach. So how do you represent? You can't just use data, right? Because storms only hit here, there, and in certain places, and so you can't use a long-term data. So you got to do it some other way. And then, prior, you could run thousands and thousands of storms to try to do that, but with all this computational power required, couldn't do that. So what was developed was the joint probability method with optimal sampling. And so what this enabled us to do is really to cover the entire parameter space of hurricanes that could impact the coast, and consider those in an efficient way as possible using these new innovative techniques. And so, and then the other thing that was really incorporated in the joint probability method allowed for this was also taking into account river flows, and how the river flows and storm surge interact, and the probabilities of those as well. So all of that was kind of incorporated into that. So we had the probabilistic analysis, and then incorporation of uncertainty. That was another thing that was really important, was making sure that uncertainty was considered in everything that we do, so that our design levels and the levels we came up with, we had an appropriate level of confidence associated with those. So incorporating that uncertainty. And then finally, resilience was incorporated into the design. So that, we had armoring, for instance, armoring of levees, so that if water levels get up and over the levees and down the other side, there was erosion protection put on there so they wouldn't catastrophically fail. We also made sure that the pumping stations and the internal drainage, pumping stations were now designed to be able to be operated and be safe, not lose power during a coastal storm event, which wasn't necessarily the case before in pre-Katrina. Yeah, and finally, the final bit of resilience that was kind of built into this design was that longer term look, where some of the levee systems were designed so that we had a large enough base where you can actually do levee in lifts. So as you build the levee, if there's subsidence or there's change in the hazard due to climate change, we could go back and do levee lifts in the future to also to be able to consistently be able and into the future be able to provide the right level of risk reduction.
That is a lot of work and a lot of change in how you even do the research and how you almost like there was a large pivot after Katrina of let's go back to the table and let's rethink how we do a comprehensive framework where
Right.
all the pieces are talking to each other and not just focus on one little piece, but looking at the big picture to solve the problem.
You really got to look at the entire system, and you've got to look at it probabilistically. Before this, it was we used what was called a standard project hurricane.
Right.
So you would just kind of take a hurricane that was about the 300 level, and you'd run it on
That's right.
a few tracks. And so what that results in is it's deterministic. It results with some inconsistent levels throughout the system, and so the right way is to take this probabilistic risk-based approach, and it's really something that we need to do more of in the Corps of Engineers and expand that into other areas as well.
Yeah, take the lessons learned from New Orleans and expand it to Houston and California and everywhere else. That we need to be looking at it from a big picture instead of just pieces of it. The impacts of hurricanes Ida, Katrina, and others is not limited just to where the storm makes landfall. In the case of Katrina, the Mississippi Gulf Coast suffered significant damages from heavy winds and massive storm surge. Since then, how has CHL taken the lead in studying both the impacts of storm surge and providing solutions to build stronger, more resilient coastlines that are so vital in protecting coastal communities?
Yeah, so again, I'm going to emphasize collaboration. We at CHL and at ERDC, everything we do, complex problems are best solved together. And so it's really about working with others and bringing the best expertise from across the entire enterprise to solve these problems. So everything I say is more than just CHL. It's more than just ERDC. It's really everybody. So that's number one. But some big areas. One is the coastal storm modeling system. So I mentioned we developed this modeling system, and we were working with the guys down in Notre Dame and North Carolina and everywhere on that. But we were building that airplane as we were flying
right.
in the following Katrina and as we were developing the HISDR system. So since that time, what we've been able to do, and that was kind of, bubble gum and chicken wire thing, put this thing together and made it work. The results were good,
right.
but it wasn't the most efficient way of doing it. It was more like a Yugo, not a Maserati.
Right.
So what we have been doing since then is really making that now a state-of-the-art system where it's way more efficient, takes less, it's faster, takes less computational resources, and provides better results because of better coupling techniques and things like that. So it's really the advancement of that modeling has been significant. And so we've applied that. So, for in the wake of Katrina and doing some coastal planning work in Louisiana, we had suites of like 300 storms that we would run to do various analyses. Since then, North Atlantic Coast Comprehensive Study, suites of storms of over 3,000. South Atlantic Comprehensive Study, including Puerto Rico, suites of storms of over 6,000. And we're able to simulate those storms really at a lower cost than what we could do originally on the Louisiana coast because of all these efficiencies that we've developed since that time. So that's one. The other, and the value of this just cannot be overstated, is it's really taking that probabilistic approach and developing the coastal hazard system. So Dr. Norberto Nadal and his team, and Dr. Chris Massey, by the way, leading the charge on the coastal storm modeling system. Dr. Norberto Nadal leading the charge on the coastal hazard system, and it's taking that that joint probability method and really developing a probabilistic coastal hazard analysis framework and database, and that's what we call the coastal hazard system. And this is just an amazing thing where we take all of those results from all of those thousands of simulations, we can put them into databases, and then they've developed tools and technologies to now characterize the hazard in a probabilistic sense. And so we can understand the annual, the annual probabilities as well as long-term probabilities of things are, and even further into the future. And so what this database and these tools and this hazard characterization allows us, we can now use this in inundation mapping. We can use it for planning and feasibility studies. We can use it for risk-based evaluation of various alternatives. engineering design. The applications are just numerous, and there's many applications that can be used. And so this resource, once we have it, it's there. Now it can be used and leveraged by coastal projects all across the enterprise, both from the Corps of Engineers, our partners, states, anyone. These databases are publicly available so that the entire enterprise can leverage these to inform all of their coastal studies and the things that we need to do. So an absolutely vital resource that has incredible value to the entire nation. And we've developed these. We've got databases now for the Great Lakes, the North Atlantic, the South Atlantic, to include Puerto Rico, the entire Gulf Coast from Florida to Texas. So we've got we got a lot of the country covered. We've proposed to do similar things on the Pacific coast. Of course, that wouldn't be hurricanes. They have different hazard drivers there, but we know how to do that, and we're proposing to do that out on the Pacific coast as well. So that's another big advancement. And then the third thing, I think, an area specifically related to coastal resilience is really the engineering with nature effort. And so Todd Bridges, national lead for that. But really, in terms of coastal protection and in the context of this discussion, really is the developing tools and technologies and best practices for the incorporation of nature and natural based features in our protective systems. So things like barrier islands, wetlands, beaches, coastal ridges, those kinds of things. And in the wake of Katrina, a big part of what we were doing was, for the first time, really understanding the interaction of hurricanes and barrier islands and wetlands. There was these rules of thumb out there that if you had X number of miles of wetlands, you get Y amount of surge reduction. Right. But it's way more complex than that. And so USGS started going out and making measurements. We were developing these very high resolution computer simulations. We were able to validate to their data and really start to understand how coastal storms and these natural features interact, so that then we can incorporate that into designs probabilistically, because a much faster moving storm, they have a much larger effect on reducing storm surge than a very slow moving storm where there's time for that surge to keep moving and moving. So all those kinds of things. So that's kind of one of the very first engineering with nature type things that we had going on. And that's continued now today, where we're doing next generation coastal morphology models. We're looking at wave attenuation of mangroves, looking at how vegetation on dunes makes them more resilient, all those types of things.
Which at the end of the day is going to help, like you said, community planners, city planners, down to the local level, make better decisions on how to bring their communities back after a hurricane, because they'll be more resilient.
That's right.
And so I want to remind our audience that you are part of the conversation. And so please ask your questions. And when I'm done asking Dr. Wamsley questions, we're going to start taking questions from our audience. So I want to remind our audience about that. So Dr. Wamsley, many of us who grew up along the Gulf Coast areas are very familiar with all the forecast models and storm surge prediction, and of course our beloved cone of uncertainty. We are also familiar with the destruction these storms can cause, and it appears that the threat is increasing. And one study shows that the damage from coastal storms has increased from $5 billion to $50 billion over the last 40 years. How does storm modeling conducted at CHL help mitigate these devastating numbers and assist emergency management officials in making risk-informed decisions? So you've talked about some of these risk-informed analysis. How does that get back to these emergency management?
Yeah, so in terms of emergency management, of course, we've talked a lot about the coastal hazard system, characterizing that hazard, and a lot of that information can be used for all kinds of planning and design. But in terms of emergency management, so first, we are not the ones that do predictions for like public advisories and evacuations. But what we do, and what's really important, is we do predictions of approaching storms to inform emergency operations. So things like all these gate closures that we've got, for instance, in the New Orleans area. Which ones do we need to close? When would we need to close them? All that type of information. We provide forecast information to kind of assist in doing that. Also, we provide information to help districts in kind of planning their response and recovery efforts, and like positioning various assets and things like that. So that's kind of our role in the whole concept of predicting storm surge. Now, our technologies, it's interesting because in the other area where we have got involved in previously was when high fidelity predictions were needed as a storm was approaching. So, for instance, during Hurricane Sandy, we got a request to say, hey, whether or not the subway system may flood, and when would that occur, and all that. These tools, your typical surge predictions for emergency management don't give you that level of fidelity, but it's very difficult, because to have that kind of resolution to be able to get those precise results, you got to be running these very highly resolved grids. So it's very challenging, and you got quick turnaround times. The forecasts are changing so rapidly, and you can't even get these things turned around in 6 hours. So that's always been a big challenge. And so it was interesting because we started to realize this. It was Hurricane Gustav in 2008. And so Hurricane Gustav, so this is 3 years after Katrina. We had already started, we developed these suites of model and started running, hundreds of storms for the Louisiana coast. And as Hurricane Gustav started to approach, we realized, well, wait a minute, and trying to run simulations, and we didn't want to dumb down the model to lose all that good detail in terms of surge hydrographs and ultimate elevations. So we started realizing, well, wait a minute, we may have something that looks like Gustav in this big database of storms we've got. So we had like maps and printouts and binders like this big, and flipping through and looking and giving that information and working with the district to give that information. But it was there. I would call this kind of the conception, if you will, of what we call the Coastal Hazards Rapid Prediction System, because we realized, hey, this large database of information has extreme value in this context. And so from that, we now have what the CHIRPS, Coastal Hazards Rapid Prediction System. And so what this does is this combines all of this information we have in these databases from these highly resolved storms that have been run, thousands and thousands and thousands of supercomputers hours to make this very valuable data set. Combine that with some artificial intelligence and machine learning. And so now we can and we develop ways, again, with our partners, to develop ways to very quickly now get the prediction from an arbitrary. We don't have to have that precise hurricane in the database, but from an arbitrary one. The other thing that this allows us to do is now we can also do an ensemble. So before, you had to run, you'd set up your system, you'd run it, and it'd take 6 hours to get everything back, all that. Now what we could do is, in a matter of seconds, that cone of uncertainty you talked about,
yes,
we could run tracks and all of that covers that entire ensemble, and in seconds get predictions. And so what that does is that gives a way more information to decision makers about what to do, because now you can also get, there's a 50% probability of this. There's a 90, that you can do it in a probabilistic sense. And so that is, this is game changing, I think. So
absolutely,
getting so much more information. So now, I think the next step is how do we figure out how to leverage this incredible bit better information that we now have in our emergency management communities. Leverage that to really help our communities out. The other thing I will mention, and this kind of gets back to just kind of coastal resilience in general, is these same kind of surrogate modeling techniques, machine learning techniques, we can now do based upon these suites of storms that cover the parameter space. We can then turn that into tens of thousands of simulations and do those tens of thousands of simulations in a matter of minutes. And so now what that allows us to do is really, and that positions us very well to do long-term risk assessments and things like that. So, there's lots of activity going on here, a lot of power and potential in the technologies that we're developing that I think is really going to be helpful.
That's incredible. And it's something that ERDC brings to the table is our high-performance computing, of being able to pull in, like you said, all of our partners and collaboration, all that happens.
That's right.
And so a great example of what we were just talking about, the work with the researchers at ERDC and USGS and NOAA to build a comprehensive framework to simulate compound coastal and inland flooding an event where storm surges from tropical events combined with rain and river flows to create extreme flooding events. How big of a threat has compound flooding become? And what have researchers learned that help forecast these future events?
Yeah, so this is a major, it's a major threat. It's a big threat. In fact, I think from 2005 to present, in direct and indirect loss, if you were to look, kind of try to encompass everything in the U.S. alone, we're looking at over $1 trillion in losses from compound flooding events. So it's a major problem. And it's interesting because in 2012 we had just finished the hurricane storm risk reduction system,
Right.
and here comes a Hurricane Isaac. Hurricane Isaac was not a Cat 4, Cat 3, wasn't a big powerful. It wasn't a powerful storm. It was a big storm. It was big, slow moving, Category 1 with lots of rain. And so what happened is that, and it didn't really challenge the HISDR system, and inside the system everything was fine. But what it did do was it created it created the event of record for areas outside of the New Orleans proper area, particularly up in the Pontchartrain Basin, because it moved slowly. It pushed water surge up into the lake for long periods of time, had heavy amounts of rainfall that was falling everywhere. So you had drainage coming in, you had rainfall on the areas. And so in places like Laplace and Manchac and all of this, just the flooding levels far exceeded Katrina.
Right.
And of course,
even though it was a Category 1.
Yeah, even though it was a Category 1. And of course, people thought, well, what's different? They built all those walls in New Orleans. Right. And so that must be why it's so much worse here. But of course, it wasn't. It was this compound flooding thing. And so we recognize this is a big deal and for a long time. And this is an area that we really need to do a lot of research in. And so we just recently have gotten some funding. We've started to look at this because the event that, kind of the poster child for compound flooding, of course, is Hurricane Harvey. That hit Houston. So it struck right at the heart of our energy sector, struck right at the heart of two of our busiest ports in America and important ports in America. And so the consequences are really dire. From Harvey alone, $125 billion in damages, in direct damages from that storm alone. So really a significant problem that we need to address. And so we've started to look at that. Some of the things that we're doing in areas of research in this area is understanding how these coastal and inland events may be related. So again, this kind of goes back to that concept of joint probabilities. The joint probabilities of, I don't know, some sort of an atmospheric river coming over the United States at the same time we have a coastal storm approaching, those kinds of things. And so understanding that. And so part of this research then is kind of incorporating these inland drivers into that coastal hazard system. So, some sort of coastal inland hazard system. But in terms of compound flooding, how do we put those things together and how do we integrate those? The other area of research that's really important here is how do we link the models? How do we link our coastal models and our inland models in such a way so that we can do this fast and efficient? What we've done in the past with this is what we'd call loose coupling. So essentially, you kind of run your coastal model, you get some boundary conditions, and you run your inland model, and you look at that, and you get some results. But really, to do that right, there's a feedback there, and so you want to couple those models and do that in a way where you can do it rapidly and get good results. And so there's a lot of research that has to go in to do that. And the final thing I'll mention here, and this is of utmost importance, is really we also need to understand how to communicate the risk to our communities better. So even if we're able to design and develop a technology that gives us which we never will be able to, but perfect predictions, if we don't communicate that information in a way that elicits the right response from our communities, the value of that is lost.
Right.
And so there's a big social science component to this and a communication science component to this. And so that's another area of how do we communicate this risk to our communities, to our stakeholders, so that we truly do help our communities be more resilient.
getting the right information to the right people at the right time
right.
is so important. So, for those of you who have just joined us, if we are talking with Dr. Ty Wamsley with the Coastal and Hydraulics Laboratory in Vicksburg, Mississippi, and now we're going to take questions from you. So, if you have asked questions, we will take them now. Let's see. All right. So, Dr. Wamsley, you talked a little bit about having these models and all the coupling and all of that. Can you talk to us about how do you validate all these models? So we have a facility in North Carolina. Can you talk to us a little bit about that?
Yeah. So all models, of course, have to be developed and verified and validated with various data. So, and that data comes from a lot of sources. So specifically with our coastal storm surge models and wave models and things like that, we've taken data from all over the place. I mentioned before, storm surge propagation across wetlands. Data from the USGS. The state of Louisiana has sites all throughout their wetlands and things like that. So that we utilize that kind of data. But specifically, you asked about the field research facility.
Right.
And of course, the field research facility, every time anyone mentions the field research facility at Duck, North Carolina, it brings a smile to my face because it's a very special place. So when you're a coastal engineer, and you take Coastal Engineering 101, you automatically learn about the field research facility. I can remember, when I was a student, my wife and I were actually visiting, we had a small, and Max, my son, yeah. Max, he was like this big. We were on the Outer Banks for a vacation, and I made her go 30 miles out of the way just so I could drive by the FRF. So that that's how iconic it is. So
you didn't even work there.
No, I didn't work at ERDC, not at all. I just wanted to see this place. And so that's how iconic it is. And so it is really a special place. So it's a world-renowned coastal science and observatory research center. It's doing just amazing work. And so they've been collecting data, coastal process and response data for over 40 years. So it's the longest term record of that type of data anywhere in the world. I mean, this data set is extremely valuable. And we make this data available. It is open access. It's open to the public so that folks all over the world can utilize this data. And in fact, there is, and this is an old number, but it's over 1,000 publications have cited data that have come from the FRF. So it really is known the world over. Just a great place. And so, as a community, in terms of hurricanes and all of that, we've learned a lot about hurricane meteorology. I think a lot of you, as you noticed that, hey, when they give these, a few years ago, these tracks, and they would be off a lot more than they are now, right? We've gotten a lot better at predicting the meteorology and the kind of the tracks of the hurricanes and things like that. And as we've mentioned, with these coupled modeling systems and all that, we've gotten a lot better at the surge and the wave modeling. And now these our wave models, the data at the FRF has been improving wave models for years and years and years. And so one of the reasons those models are so good is because of data that we've been collecting at the FRF. We have wave gauges all the way from off the shelf all the way in to a LiDAR that shows the waves rushing up on the beach. So we have a wave array that really covers the entire thing, and it's been very valuable. But where the FRF really kind of comes into is this last piece where what we don't do really well is the impact of these these forces on the coast and how the coast evolves. This is a difficult problem, very, very difficult problem. Waves crashing, longshore currents, sediment moving, wind blowing. And so it's very difficult to get this data. It's very hard, but that's what, the folks at the FRF have been learning how to do over the last 40 years. And so we have an absolute world-class team of people out there that are collecting data sets during storm events at the right timescales that really can help us enhance these models so that we better understand how these water levels and waves are impacting our coast and evolving the coast. And so this data is just really, really important in that. And so really all of our best coastal evolution models, they've utilized data from the FRF. All of our best wave models from around the world, they've utilized data from the FRF. And so the value is just incredible. The other real value that we've seen out at the FRF is also in the development and testing of new sensor data. So being able to get better measurements is a big part of what's happening. And it's in this better data that we're able to collect with these new technologies is really allowing us to then dial in our predictive technologies better as well. And so they're very important. It's a very important place for that as well. And I'm going to come back again to the whole collaboration thing, because the FRF really is it's a collaborative space. It's a collaborative place. And so there's been multiple projects over the years where we have researchers come from other agencies, overseas, various universities and all of that to do coastal research at the FRF, and everybody wants to come to the FRF. In fact, right now we have with the U.S. Coastal Research Program, in conjunction with them, the USGS, NOAA, we are conducting the Deering Nearshore Events Experiment. DUNEX. Yeah, DUNEX is what it's called. And so we have multiple universities that are engaged in this, multiple agencies that are engaged in this, coming together and collecting data at the FRF during events. And then that, of course, the research is going to feed back into all of our technologies across all of our federal agencies and really help local. And one of the big focuses of the USCRP is really taking all this new data and knowledge, and how do we make that really valuable for our communities. So we're very excited about that. And that's going on right now out there at the FRF.
That's right. And that's incredible work. I love always hearing about the stories from DUNEX, one of my favorite projects, and all the collaboration and cooperation that you see. And that's one of the beautiful things about ERDC is our ability to bring in the right people to help solve these very complex problems. So we're going to take another question from the audience. ERDC is known for coming up with innovative solutions to the very problems you've been discussing, but how do we get these technologies into the hands of coastal managers, emergency operation personnel, and decision makers?
Yeah. So this is the tech transfer. I mean, it is a big deal, and it's something quite frankly that as research organizations, it's tough. It's tough to do this. And so I think one of the things that we've been doing here at ERDC is really trying to increase and events such as this increase our communication with the outside world, so that people are aware of what's going on. Because ultimately, and what's happening, in the research and development environment, you develop capabilities, you get things that work, but then the rubber meets the road when you put that into practice. And in order to do that, you've really got to be again, we come back to partnering, collaboration, with working with others. And so how can we partner on various projects, get with communities to get this stuff into their hands so they can try it and use it and then give feedback so that we can improve it. And so this is something, it's a challenge. I think we're doing a lot better now with our outreach and all of that. And I think just finding the other challenge there is finding the funding mechanisms to really allow us to do that in a meaningful way. But it's certainly, I can tell you, our team of people and all the great people we've got, and I could list name after name of folks, and all of them want nothing more than their technology to be used and to be used to help people and help our nation and help our communities. And so we have a lot of passionate people about that. And so I think if we get the right funding and make sure we continue to build these partnerships and the right partnerships, we can make that happen.
That's wonderful. So we have a question from Jeb. He's asking, how can we expand holistic approach to other major infrastructure programs, looking at the entire picture instead of individual projects?
Yeah. So, that question, the first thing that pops into my mind with that question is the HISNRs performed really well for Hurricane Ida. And the power lines fell over, right. So wind, so the wind event was problem and all of that. And so we really do, as a nation, we really do need to try to integrate even beyond even beyond the
storm
things,
surge,
the storm surge and the things that we think about from that perspective. And how do all these things work together? Because quite honestly, if the power lines fall down, and that's real, and our pumping stations had backup power and all of that, but that creates all these things, cause cascading risks, and so we really do need to do that. And so again, I think how do we do that? It's we've got to be again. I think it's through the power of collaboration and getting these various groups that work in these various areas talking and working together. And how do we leverage the various technologies and capabilities to inform other areas that we may not even be thinking of, because it's just not our area and what we think about.
Absolutely. So what is the most difficult part of predicting storm hazards, and how has ERDC helped close that gap?
Well, yeah, what's the most difficult part? I don't, that's an interesting question. It's all difficult. It's all difficult.
It's all hard.
Yeah, it's all hard. So, and it starts with meteorologic prediction. And of course, the things that we're doing here at ERDC is, given the meteorologic information that we have, converting that into what do the wind, basically it's translating what do the winds mean in terms of water levels and waves, for instance, in the context of coastal storms. And so some of the toughest parts of that are just the meteorological parameters and all that. There's still a lot of work that needs to be done in that area. I think the difficult part, but we're getting good at now taking that information and making these estimates. And I think the next hard part is kind of the things we've already talked about, the whole concept of compound flooding.
Mm-hmm.
How do we take the inland pieces and the coastal pieces and put that together? The other real difficult part is the interaction with the landscape, and how does vegetation impact this, and as and what happens during and really the evolution of things during a storm. So for instance, a barrier island as dunes lower, they're lowering during the storm. Right now, we don't have that incorporated into our modeling. So the morphology modeling, that's really hard. Sediment, the old joke is that Einstein told his son that don't do sediment transport because it's too hard. And it is, it's hard. And morphologic evolution is even more difficult, it can be even more difficult than that. And so, the sediment things, the morphology evolution, the compounding effects of flooding inland and coastal flooding, all are difficult problems that we still need to be working on to close the gaps on that.
So Robert wants to know, what did we learn that can be projected in terms of modeling to riverine flooding in systems like the Missouri River or Cape Fear?
So you're from the Katrina experience, one of the things that we've been working on, this is not, of course, a lot of that had to do with the interaction of storm surge and river flow. Things that we're doing on the riverine side, a lot of that work is going on. We've got work going on in that area with the Mississippi Valley Division on the Mississippi River, and really trying to understand that. And right now we're working and partnering with the National Water Center, NOAA, National Water Center, other Bureau of Rec, USGS. We're really looking to get a group of an interagency group together to build a new framework, a comprehensive framework for doing inland hydrology modeling, which of course then leads to your river, river modeling. And so what we want to be able to do is to do that on continental scales and simulate, just like we were talking about here, simulating all the relevant physical processes, and we're able to do that on very large kind of continental scales for our coastal models, and being able to do that with our hydrology models as well. So those some of the stuff that we're talking with the National Water Center now, and partnering and doing some of that work as well. So I think, and then the whole risk approach that we're doing on the coastal side needs to be moved into the inland side. Our river systems are not, the planning on those is not risk-based. It's more probable maximum flood. It's kind of event-based, more deterministically based stuff. And we really need to look at that from from a probabilistic risk-based analysis standpoint. I think that's a big thing that we need to really push hard for moving forward.
Okay, we have a question from Carol. Given your modeling efforts and the time known before a storm will hit a coast, how is your assessment translated to city managers to allow coastal dwellers to get accurate, timely information? We've had storms poised to hit the coast, but changed dramatically once they hit land. For example, Isaacs was a Category 1 when it hit North Carolina coast full on, but unanticipated storm surge and embedded tornadoes were very unexpected, and we were not prepared.
Yeah. So first, for us, a lot of what we, again, in terms of us and forecasting and as storms are coming ashore, we do things that inform emergency operations. NOAA, the National Weather Service, they're the ones that are doing predictions and then getting that information out to the public. So, and we work with our districts. So the way that our information kind of gets translated, I guess, into the communities is really through our districts, who are the people on the ground doing the response, doing response and recovery efforts. So that's, at least from our perspective, that's kind of handled through those district offices.
And we talked previously about how a Category 1, where you think it's not going to do a lot of damage, all of a sudden you have all this compound flooding.
Yeah,
and
that, that's right, and that all of that goes back to how we need to do research and how we communicate these things. One of the big things, I think this is kind of a good example of that, and I think a lot of people are aware of this, is we've always talked about hurricanes in terms of Saffir-Simpson scale.
That's right.
Has everything to do with wind speeds.
That's right.
But it does. But surge levels are not just a function of wind speed. They're a function of wind speed. They're a function of the radius to maximum winds. They're a function of how fast the storm is moving. They're a function of a lot of different things. And so the surge, so there's been talk, and they've come up with different scales for like surge potential. And so that's the kind of thing that we've got to do more research on. How do we appropriately communicate the totality of risk to the community in a way that it can be ingested and then elicit the right response to that? Because tornadoes, a hurricane, wind speeds, that's another wind speed thing, and those are often associated with hurricanes. So how do we? Tornadoes are often associated with hurricanes. So how do we, take all that information and boil it down to elicit a good response? It's an area of research I think that's desperately needed.
How are USACE districts using the models you've been discussing as part of civil works projects, prioritization, and design, especially in light of pending congressional action on infrastructure? Let me repeat that question one more time. How are USACE districts using the models you've been discussing as part of the civil works projects, prioritization, and design, especially in light of pending congressional action on infrastructure?
Well, they utilize, the data from the coastal hazard system and all of that. They're utilizing that in their projects that they've got, their various projects on their coast. In terms of prioritization, I don't believe it. I don't believe that's, that it's not being used for prioritization of projects, but it's certainly this type of information is being ingested and used in the project, project planning, project design, all of those things. So they take this information, in the case of the coastal hazard system, they can take that themselves, work on it themselves. Oftentimes they may engage us to help with some of that, but they're taking this information, utilizing this information and these technologies to inform their projects.
Very good. You mentioned earlier machine learning to simulate storms. Are you able to simulate protection systems and use machine learning to predict the most valuable or viable protection methods in storms or other systems? So how are we using the machine learning and AI? How are we leveraging that?
Yeah, they're going to have to talk to somebody a lot smarter than me. We're starting to get out of my capacity, but we have not used machine learning in that in that way. What we've been utilizing with it is how do we take all of this data, this hazard data, and get more useful data and information out of it. It's certainly something that could be done. And so one of the things that we have established on the Civil Works R&D Steering Committee out of USA's headquarters has established some new strategic focus areas. And one of those strategic focus areas has to do with big data analytics, AI, autonomy, machine learning, these kinds of things. And so if we are successful in getting funding to fund that type of work, this is the kind of thing that we want to do, is to really, because there's a lot of data out there. It's how do you take all of this data and put it into actionable information. And so that is something that the Corps has on its radar screen as a priority. And if we're able to get those resources, I think the Corps will be delving into that.
That is incredible. This sounds like a far bigger problem for just one lab to handle. Talk about CHL is partnering with other labs at ERDC and outside agencies to tackle some of these big challenges.
Yeah, as I've said,
all today.
Yeah. This is nothing is done. Certainly, nothing is done just CHL. I mean, this is really it's all of ERDC. Right. So a lot of the things that we've been talking about today, Information Technology Lab is engaged in. GSL has been engaged in. Environmental Lab and CHL are tied at the hip on a lot of these things, particularly when we start talking about engineering with nature and all of that. And as I've said before, everything we do, literally everything we do, is with partners, academic, industry, other agencies, and we are constantly striving to increase those, because that's where you get great ideas, and you move forward faster by combining all the talents of a larger group of people. So if I didn't make that point, I'm gonna get.
I agree.
Yeah, I'm here. I'm here really talking about ERDC today. Is the way that I look at it.
Exactly. Can the modeling account for potential diminishing size of sand dunes, living reefs, and other natural solutions during a storm event?
Can you repeat?
All right,
that?
let me say that one more time. Can the modeling we do, can it account for potential diminishing size of sand dunes, living reefs, and other natural solutions during a storm event?
Yeah. So that was one of the things I mentioned in terms of kind of next step is incorporating the morphologic evolution of natural nature-based features into that storm modeling system. Now, what we can do is we can run our storm on. This is kind of that idea of kind of a loose coupling. We do have some technologies that allows us to look at the morphologic evolution of models. But what we would do is we would take the results from the coastal storm modeling system, apply those as boundary conditions to force our coastal morphology models. But that information then is not being fed back in to look at ultimate, flooding.
It's not a true coupling.
Yeah,
right.
So we don't have that coupled. Now, that is part of the overall vision and goal, would be able to incorporate that in. Now, that's one of those things, again, everything's a trade-off between computational efficiency and how much increase in value you get from incorporating those things. But we definitely see, there would be specific areas of interest where we would want to be able to do that. And so that is part of the plan, and the continued evolution of the coastal storm modeling system is to incorporate that.
You take a state like Mississippi that has a big oyster industry, or other states, so some of these things could impact local economies or state economies, so if they could better protect that. And so, do we have any more questions? Dr. Wamsley, if you could integrate and imagine it, what would your perfect hurricane and storm protection system entail? So if you could do anything you wanted to do, unlimited money, sky's the limit. What would your perfect hurricane and storm protection system entail? And of course, we know that can never happen. Yeah. But let's just, what if?
Well, there's never going to be a perfect one, and I don't know exactly how to answer that question. But when you're designing a system, the number one thing is you really need to look at it holistically and comprehensively. So you want to understand what is the natural, and this idea of redundancy and resilience, right? And so you want to look at your natural system. You want to understand how your natural system is helping to mitigate some of that risk through like wetlands and natural features. But you cannot, we cannot rely on natural features alone. They're part of an integrated solution. So then you want to look at, hey, what are the kind of the structures that we need to be looking at? And I would love to start seeing more dynamic structure. I think of things that, dynamic structures, particularly in riverine flooding or things like that, where you could actually start having floating, by increasing resilience by having structures that can float up and down, as things as floods happen. But I think that to me, the ultimate system is one where you're able to integrate, and then you got to have things like buyouts and building codes. And so one of the greatest risk reduction methodologies in the world is to not do things in highly risky places. And so let's have really intelligent development plans, zoning, building codes, and all of those kinds of things. And these technologies can inform all of those things. Where is the right place for buyouts? And then those areas can be used for environmental restoration and to create other benefits and things like that. So I think it's really just to me, it's this kind of this holistic, really approach that we're just leveraging the best of the natural system, and then engineering area and then doing engineering in the areas where we need to for structures. And then not doing things that just don't make sense by being in highly, highly risky places.
Right.
Sometimes that's unavoidable due to, for the economics of a region, but.
Very good. Yeah. Well, thank you so much for joining us today. And thank you to our audience. I want to say that next week, the week of the 25th to the 29th of October, you can join us and continue this conversation on coastal resiliency at our Innovation Summits, the USACE Innovation Summit, and you can register for that at usaceinnovation.org. And I also would invite you to also learn more about us by following our podcast on your favorite podcast player. So it's the power of ERDC podcast.org. Thank you so much.